You are listening to The Dish on Health IT, brought to you by Point of Care Partners, a leading health IT consultancy. Each episode will feature a rotating panel of senior consultants and guests who will talk about trends and innovations in health IT, while also highlighting how organizations can leverage these advances to solve their business problems. Today's episode features HL7's Codex, which stands for Common Oncology Data Elements Extensions. Codex aims to improve data collection and exchange in cancer care and research. Senior Health Information Technology consultants Gary Austin and co-host Jocelyn Keegan welcome guest Steve Bratt, who leads Codex and MITRE's Health Standards and Interoperability Group. Today's discussion highlights the work Codex is doing to address the complex challenges unique to cancer care and how organizations can get involved. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and that you'll share your topic ideas with us by emailing us at podcast@pocp.com.
Good day, everybody, and welcome to the ongoing adventures of The Dish on Health IT. I'm your host, Gary Austin, affectionately known as Lumpy, and even more so with the COVID-19 problem that many of us are experiencing right now. We at Point of Care Partners are health IT consultants with 100 plus associates in over 35 states. We work across all stakeholder groups, payers, healthcare delivery entities, pharma, health IT vendors, and government agencies. And we're viewed as an independent, trusted party, the Switzerland of consultancy. Joining me from Boston this episode, both our guests, is my co-host, Jocelyn Keegan, who is one of our leads at Point of Care Partners and also the program manager for the FHIR API Accelerator. And our special guest, Steve Bratt, the lead for Codex, the Common Oncology Data Elements Extensions, HL7 FHIR Accelerator. That's the most words I've ever strung together in one sentence, I think. So Steve, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We much appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Looking forward to talking with you.
Excellent. This is an episode that's very near and dear to my heart. A couple years back, my little sister died from cancer. And I have to believe that a part of that, her early death was due to this 19th century level of data interoperability. Going to specialists here, there, down in Philly, over in Boston, up in New York, and whatnot. And every time rerunning tests, not having data available, not having shared medical records and whatnot. So, you know, part of her death, her early death, I blame on the system, as it were. And so I tried to bring a lot to interoperability to kind of rectify that situation. And I think the stuff that Jocelyn and Steve have done is just absolutely awesome. You guys are doing some great things around integrating mCODE, which is a standard cancer data set, and leveraging FHIR API technology, much like Da Vinci is, to accelerate clinical modeling and care delivery and to create significant improvements in cancer patient care and whatnot. But I thought we should really go right to, you know, Steve, you heading up the effort here, and get folks to understand how critically important this accelerator is and what you need to advance this even more rapidly to try and move this along. You know, cancer is just a scourge on this country, frankly, on the whole world. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on governmentally and a lot of stuff going on with the oncology groups out there and a lot of stuff going on around data interoperability. So welcome, and why don't you spend a few minutes kind of get us up to speed on Codex in terms of, you know, where it came from and background and you know, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. We started work on the idea of a standard health record at MITRE. MITRE is the organization I work for. It's a not-for-profit. It works only in the public interest, does not compete with anyone. I guess it's like the Switzerland but we're not a consultant. We work mainly, almost all for government agencies. And as a federal requirement, we spend a fraction of our income on basic research. So the project, the Standard Health Record, came out of some basic research funding that MITRE pulled together for an internal R&D project. And we realized that doing this kind of wide look at Standard Health Record was big. So we said, let's focus on a really critical problem within health. And cancer was the one we chose. Nearly 40% of all of us will get cancer someday. In your situation, my mother passed away from cancer when she was 52. We've all been touched by cancer. And so it's a terrible problem. It's also a very expensive problem. $150 billion a year goes into cancer care and research. So it's a massive challenge, and it's complex too. Like you mentioned, the situation of when you break your leg, you may go to one provider and they can care for you, and that works out fine. When you have cancer, you're seeing oncologists, pathologists, maybe your genomics information is being collected, radiology, all these different specialists, sometimes not in the same practice, quite often not being able to talk with each other. Like if the three of us were talking today in 3 different languages, we would get by using Google Translate or something, but we probably would make mistakes. We'd probably misunderstand, and it would be very slow and inefficient. And that's kind of the state of healthcare, cancer care being no different, but maybe even more complex. So we focused on cancer, and we decided, what can we do to develop a common language for cancer data sharing? And that's where this mCODE came in, Minimal Common Oncology Data Elements, mCODE. And we went, we'll talk a little bit later, I think, about stakeholders, but we went to the American Society of Clinical Oncology, where they have expertise in all the areas, domains around cancer. And they convened a group of real experts across pathology, radiology, surgery, medicine, chemotherapy, and other kinds of treatments. And they said these are the most important 90-ish data elements needed to treat all cancer cases that were really important, the really most important cancer cases. So mCODE gives you that minimal language, kind of the minimal number of nouns, verbs, and adjectives and adverbs you would need to have a relatively proficient conversation. So that's the start. That was the genesis of taking this idea of a standard health record and say, can we at least get a standard longitudinal health record for cancer patients with a minimal set of data? And then let's build out from there. And that's where Codex comes in, which I'll talk more about in a little bit.
Got it. So interesting point you brought up there. So there's this concept that we've talked about in prior podcasts about USCDI, which is sort of a standard primary care, let's call it, data interchange data set. mCODE is a data set sort of more specifically targeted towards oncology, right? So is that managed? Is that like, oh, it's 90 data fields and that's where it's going to stay? Or is that something that continues to evolve as the practice of oncology evolves?
It may do the latter, but probably not so much. I mean, you brought up a good point, though, that I should talk about, and maybe it's been talked about before on the podcast, but there's sort of a layering effect. There's FHIR, which provides a level of sort of transport interoperability and some kinds of semantic interoperability, but not very precise. USCDI helps to make that, and the equivalent, the FHIR implementation guide called US Core provides a little more framework around really common things across health, not just across cancer, obviously, but across all of health, patient demographics, treatments, diagnoses, and so on. mCODE builds on top of that. So we're leveraging all this great work that's been done by larger communities for cancer care. We've already started to work on some other domains as well. So we're trying to build upon the work that's been done, because even though 40% of us will get cancer, we also are going to get other diseases and we're going to experience other health challenges or successes that need to be captured in our health record too. So we want to have that underlying language for health be the same. And on top of that, we can add the cancer information. Now, you asked about, of course, all areas of health are changing all the time, but when you look at some of the basic elements of mCODE around cancer staging, describing tumors, around cancer treatments, whether they're surgical, medical, or other types, radiation therapy, around the genomics that are specific to cancer, biomarkers.
Yeah.
These kind of things are leveraging existing resources but building on top of that for cancer.
Got it. And Jocelyn, how does Codex and Da Vinci interrelate, or do they yet, or will they? How do they come together?
I think that a key theme that Steve is really getting at, and I think we've had in our past podcasts where we've brought in folks that are working on other initiatives, is this really idea in FHIR that we're building communities and that we're really picking up this really powerful toolkit. And we're, through the work of these, the subject matter experts in a particular domain, building out to sort of the touch points and the end points what you really need for specificity to make this really powerful tool work. And so there are places where we'll overlap Da Vinci use cases with some of the Codex use cases. And we've actually just started to talk about really how and where the Codex team can build upon some of the frameworks that we've been building between payers and providers. Prior auth is a great way. You know, Steve's got a use case that's on clinical pathways, and of course, authorization around, you know, what is going to be covered by the insurance company during somebody's care journey is incredibly important, amazingly wasteful and frustrating for everybody involved today. So, you know, being able to pick up and use what we're doing and extend it for purpose by the people that know these workflows the best, I think will be incredibly important. And I expect that what you'll see as more and more of the accelerators mature is that there'll be places where one of us starts a particular framework first, and then it gets picked up and extended by the next wave of people. And the FHIR community in general will be able to pick up and leverage and add on and add on. You know, we're really, I like to describe it as, I think we're at like sort of maybe we're at step 5 and Steve's at step 1 of a staircase that's, you know, 2,000 steps tall, really in this journey of bringing the full power of what FHIR can bear, and really the shift towards APIs, you know, out in the marketplace. I think Codex is really amazing in so many ways because it really is focused on this, you know, area that touches all of us in our personal lives, not just our professional lives, and that there's so much to be gained for unlocking and freeing this data on so many different layers. And I think that that's something that it's a little different than the other accelerators that have started, that it really is each one of the use cases is its own special community that's pulling together the best and brightest. And it's really fantastic to watch, you know, the progress that they're making and leverage the existing relationships and work of what's already happening in the other accelerators and FHIR community at large.
So you bring up an interesting point there. So Steve, I know a lot of the Da Vinci folks, and I've met a lot of them over time, or knew some, you know, even before Da Vinci, frankly, but who are the types of folks that are engaged with you from a Codex perspective? Are they the, you know, sort of interoperability wonks coming from academic medical centers? Are they the health IT vendors? Or are they the, you know, the CMIOs that maybe sort of bridge data and clinical practice and information technology? Or who sits on your committees?
Well, my whole career has been around building communities around things. This is the first time in cancer, that's for sure. Yeah. But we usually like to start with the thought leaders. You know, who are the people who are listened to? We're fortunate enough at MITRE that our CTO is an MD and has a lot of great connections in the community, the medical community, not only around Boston, but around the world. And he introduced us to Dr. Monica Bertagnoli, who was at the time the president of the American Society for Clinical Oncology. And she was completely on board from the very first conversation. And she has reached to 50,000 oncologists. So you kind of find these thought leaders like Monica, like Anish Chopra, the former CTO of the US government, John Halamka, who's been very involved in interoperability for 20 years, now connected to the National Academy of Medicine, Dr. Victor Zhao, who's been a big advocate. So we got these sort of high-level people who not only are listened to, but they help you to develop the vision and the value proposition, and then get the word out and get communities built together. I mean, we can't do this with just the thought leaders. We need to have the people from the health systems, from the payers, from the government agencies, regulators, and others, population health people. We need patients involved, and we're just starting to do that as well. So these are all critical, but it started with kind of a set of thought leaders and a vision that's compelling. And then you got to do the work. You got to pay off on that vision, and that's where Codex comes in to build the use cases around mCODE that provide value.
So if somebody, it's interesting you mentioned patients too, because you know, occasionally they're involved in actually cancer care, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that and how you'll get them engaged, because I think that's very important. You don't want just a clinical perspective, right?
Absolutely. And we have a number of use cases. If you want me to mention one, I'll start with one called.
I'm trying to talk about use cases. So
yeah, what about one thing that's important about our philosophy in Codex too. We're not about building implementation guides. That's a means to the end. The end is better care and research.
Yeah.
So to do that, we do need to understand what data are needed. We need to build those into really great FHIR implementation guides, but we need the information on those guides to be implemented in real software. Maybe it's test software initially, but real products for that product to be delivered and be used and provide value. That's why the health systems are so important to us, because they buy a lot of that software. And so getting them engaged has been really instrumental to getting companies like Epic committing to implement mCODE in their systems, which is amazing. But they have a lot of customers who've asked for it.
Sure.
Again, going back through our value chain to the thought leaders and the ASCOs and the Astros, who are the radiation oncology people, and others who are going out and saying, this is really good. We need to leverage this, put this in your products. So one of the first, go back to the question about patients. So one of the first use cases is around patient clinical trials matching. It's a very inequitable process now, and very slow, like a lot of the other processes in health. But right now, most patients who get into clinical trials happen to be ones connected to the major academic medical centers. Yet that leaves a large, like maybe 3/4 of all patients who are looking for trials somewhere, who happen to be in communities where they don't have a academic medical center, who don't have a lot of trials. They're out there using various online matching services, which, you know, God bless them, they do a wonderful job. It's a lot of work. They're taking data from clinicaltrials.gov.
Very expensive.
They're trying to put it into some structure that doesn't exist yet, and then they're trying to match up me, the patient, with trials that are specific to maybe my type of cancer.
Right.
So we came up with the American Cancer Society. One of our early champions is leading the charge on this one to automate the collection of data from EHRs, sending those to matching services using mCODE. It's all in mCODE, and providing back a structured clinical trials that match the characteristics of that particular patient, and then allow the patient to search, kind of like a search engine, to be able to search through the results, prioritize which ones they want based on which phase trial it is, how far it is from their house, how many patients are being enrolled.
Could that be done inversely? Could you?
Yes. Yep.
You could identify, here's the protocol that we're after, right? And
the pharmaceutical companies are involved in this too, because they love to have them structure their trials. You know, if they can structure their trials using mCODE, that would help them to enroll patients faster, help them to find patients who would be a good match for their trials.
Yeah.
The other problem with current trials now is they're not equitable in terms of the distribution of patients who get enrolled. In fact, they purposely exclude patients with comorbidities like diabetes and so on. This will allow for a much broader range of patients to be sought. They could still bucket them in different groups of those with and without comorbidities, for example, but they'll be able to find these patients. These patients will be able to get involved, have hope, and hopefully contribute not only to addressing their cancer condition, but also future patients.
There's also, I would imagine there's also diversity challenges, both gender and wealth and racial and everything else out there. Right?
All of the above.
In terms of they're doing that.
Another use case we have addresses that is around how do we actually conduct clinical trials out of data in the EHR. Right now, clinical trials, they actually, if you're in a clinical trial, you get your data structured, and it'll be very high quality data. But only about 3 to 6% of cancer patients actually get enrolled in clinical trials. So if we can leverage all of the data of all the cancer patients directly out of the EHR and mCODE, now you've got 100% of the patients, cancer patients, millions of patients from which we can learn. Now, maybe the quality of the data will vary a little bit for those patients who are in routine care, under standards of care versus in trials. They'll have a massive amount of information, again, representing all cancer patients, not just those fortunate enough to get into that trial. So working with, on that one, working with the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology, working with big health systems like Mayo, Brigham and Women's, Dana-Farber, University of Pennsylvania. We're talking to probably 20 others too about getting engaged in this real world data use case as well around mCODE.
Do you have this sort of model in your head that there's a big old cancer patient on, data dump in the sky somewhere, data repository in the sky somewhere that everybody can bang against to do analyses? And oh, by the way, maybe I have an AI engine sitting on top of that that's just trolling all the time.
Well, of course, there's a lot of we have to absolutely always be careful about patient privacy and protecting the data. There are ways to do that, but what we sort of envisage is that we can bring the EHRs up to a higher level, not only of quality of data, which involves a lot more than standards, but also in a standard language, this language of mCODE, based on FHIR. This would allow these EHRs to become a source of patient data for lots of use cases. The two I mentioned, patient clinical trials matching, conducting real-world data trials, for prior authorization, like Jocelyn mentioned, for reporting to registries. Health systems report to tens of cancer registries, doing what one of my colleagues, Dr. Jimmy Chen, calls swivel chair interoperability. Somebody's typing the data in the EHR over here, then they're retyping it into another little form over here, into an Excel sheet there. What a waste of time. Sometimes it takes the CDC 30 months to collect patient data and cancer patient data. Can we cut that down to a week? So there's so much promise here around being able to have the EHRs be a quality store of standardized data and then using it for all these use cases.
And Gary, I think that this is a really important point that Steve is making, because it's really about the community, the right people, and it's not this exercise of the wonks, right? This literally is the people that are living and breathing this every day, defining the workflows, figuring out what data is required. And I think that this last point that Steve was just making about the registry and the swivel chair aspect of it is, at the end of the day, the secondary, tertiary, the additional use and use cases that we'll be able to develop in the community, because FHIR makes this data fungible and portable, to Steve's point, with all the right constraints in place, is the part that is really game changing here, right? Because getting it out for the first time, somebody does because they have to do it, right? To put it in the PDF, to put it on the fax machine, to rekey it into a portal. Yeah. But if we can actually make that data move and we can make it accessible, that project that you would never be able to get funded or ever be able to do, now all of a sudden becomes possible. And this ability with the accelerators to bring the right interested people to do the right thing is amazingly powerful. And you can hear from the sort of list of folks that Steve rattles off that there's real work being done here, because people are solving actual real world problems they have and have all agreed, let's do it together, as opposed to it didn't work off in our own, little walled gardens trying to figure it out on our own, and getting the vendors to sort of, the customers to push the vendors forward has been amazing.
Got it. So both of y'all independently mentioned prior authorization, right? Arguably the worst business process that exists out there, right? Need it, and there's plenty of reasons you need it, and I think most people understand that, okay? But it's an absolutely horrible business process for the provider, it's an absolutely horrible business process for the payer, and it's a horrible business process for the patient, right? So how do the two core accelerators here, one focused on sort of payer provider interoperability and one focused around a specific domain set there, okay? How do you come together to do this? And I'll go back to, my sister's situation when she was going through her cancer fight. There were delays of weeks between treatment protocols and things, because, her payer, said, oh, we gotta, we're not sure if we can do this or not. It might be experimental, blah, blah, blah. Or, oh, we lost your paperwork. Sorry, it'll be another 2 weeks and things like that. And it was maddening, just absolutely maddening to see that happen. So how do two accelerators like yourself, and maybe there's some others that have to play in too, but how do you come together to more rapidly accelerate the whole prior auth process? What does that look like? And I say this with I'm putting two Bostonians in a room together to fight something out. So God knows where this will go, but.
No fights here. But Jocelyn, why don't you go first and talk about Da Vinci and how we can layer on top of that?
So I think that the layering is the key here, right? Because I think that, what we found now that we're, rounding out year 3 with Da Vinci, which is kind of insane to think about, is that what we've been doing a lot of places, and I think Steve would tell you he's doing the same on some of his early use cases, is really laying that groundwork, that framework. What's that layer above, just basic FHIR and US core, to say this is how for these two players and these workflows that we're going to use this data. But the complexity around a prior authorization for an oncology patient is
Huge.
Massively more complicated, right, than whether or not I can get my knee surgery approved or whether I can get my specialty med drop shipped to my house. And so I think that what we've been focused on in a lot of the participation on Da Vinci has really been on the sort of what are the things that we can calve off. And there's complexity, there's differences workflow wise in what the Codex team is going to be looking to do because of the nature how prior authorization is so intrinsically tied to the actual plan of care for a particular patient. And so really the value I think that Steve's team will bring to the table is to say, how do we pick up these utility tools around prior authorization that you've built and reorder them and augment them and expand them so that really we can reuse components that we've already built in. We can leverage the investment that the EHRs and the payers and the provider groups are going to make into exposing these initial APIs. But it really is going to be about what is that, sort of concentrated group that's really saying, what is the workflow? How is it different than a typical prior auth? How are we dealing with the fact that half of this stuff is on pharmacy and half of it's on medical benefit, right? So they're different standards and different players. So I guess to me, the work to be done together is to essentially extend and build on the existing work with the community that Steve's going to bring to bear. And I don't know, Steve, if you want to talk a little bit about sort of what is different about an oncology prior authorization than a typical prior auth.
One thing, also Jocelyn and I have another commonality in that a lot of our staff are working on Da Vinci too. We have a large number of people working on about 12 implementation guides. So we know what's going on, that we know the value it could provide if people can, if implementers can, vendors can adopt it and companies use it, both on the payer side and the provider side. So we're very strong on the provider side, and we're going to work with Da Vinci to kind of provide that expertise on, well, what does a prior auth workflow look like for oncology? And then with Da Vinci about, well, how would one use their tools and modules to test that out and demonstrate the art of the possible. So, for example, one of the things in oncology that's really important, first of all, as you know, chemotherapies could be $500,000 to $1 million a year. Sure. So yeah, there's some prior authorization justified there, but there's also patients who are following a fairly typical, what we call pathway, a clinical pathway in terms of their care, and some that go off pathway because of could be because of comorbidities, it could be something that's uncommon. There are these clinical pathways that talk about the standard of care. Most of them are in PDF files now, and there are a lot of vendors trying to implement these into software. And for all these vendors, if the incoming clinical data about the patient were standardized, it makes that software simpler. It makes the sharing of those results easier with payers, with other clinicians, and with patients. So the idea behind prior authorization would be if we could share the pathway as a patient on pathway or off. Say this pathway ABC, this Mrs. Jones is on pathway. You send it to the prior auth. The payer that Mrs. Jones's insurer knows what that means. It knows about that pathway, so it's a standard pathway, and could say, okay, or at least be able to say, okay, that's pretty close, but if you can give me 2 more bits of information, I can approve it quickly. Right. And I think it'd minimize it, it'd speed up this prior auth for these patients who really need care, and reduce the number of times where you have a real complex problem that requires back and forth a lot. And hopefully electronic back and forth, not faxes like it is today. So there's so many promising things that could be done working with Da Vinci on this particular problem, provided we get the payers we need to get the payers to the table, because we got the clinicians, and they, believe me, every one of them talks about the burden and the burnout resulting in prior auth. There's a lot of other side effects besides patient care here that ultimately result in affecting patient care.
It's interesting.
You'll have a lot of people on our side, on the oncology side, who'll be raring to go.
Yeah, it's interesting because as I work with a lot of payers, and that sentiment is very much on the other side too of the house, right? The medical officers, medical executives that are reviewing these complex prior auths and whatnot. There's no way, I said it on a little oncology webinar today just to bring myself up to speed, and they were saying like 4,000 new papers a week or something like that. Probably it was an insane number. I mean, there's no way anybody could conceivably keep current, right? And so
that's why the pathways are so important, because the pathways tell the doc what's current. And so even if you're especially in a community cancer center, you can't go down the hall to the foremost breast oncologist in the world. At least you could have the standard of care that's agreed by experts. This is the right way to go to treat Mrs. Jones, even if you're in rural Kansas and not necessarily in downtown Boston.
I think this is such an important point, and I think that when we look at the type of work that we're doing by freeing this data via API is to be able to automate where possible, right? Just remove the human factor so that it becomes, to your point, Gary, the prior auth is happening, but it's happening in the background because it's between trusted entities, right? And the data can flow and there doesn't need to be human interaction, except for when there does. But I think the key that Steve is getting at, and I think is incredibly important on all of this, is how do we get to equity, right? That no matter where you're physically located in the country, you have the same access to the same type of treatment possibilities, right? That somebody has to those of us that live in Boston and are in the middle of all of this. But I think the second piece is the transparency, right? That there's so much unknown when somebody's going through their initial cancer diagnosis, right? And the ability to be able to say at a patient-specific level, here's what your options are, and here's what your insurer covers or doesn't cover, and these are the type of pre-treatment screening or tests that you can or you can't do, I think is game-changing in being able to really help that patient, right, at the focus, the patient that's paying the payer for care and is, in a critical point in time in their care journey. Mm-hmm. I think what's really important is everyone, and I think you said it, Gary, everyone is unhappy with the current state of prior authorization. And what's happening now is that payers have these sort of blunt force tools they put in place, right? Somebody gets a cancer diagnosis and they flatten all the prior authorization, right? And then eventually it catches back up with them and there's sort of this retreading that happens. So I think if we can figure out how to get the patient-specific data up front and available while somebody is going through this process, we sort of have artificially, because of the way that HIT has developed, separated out administrative from clinical. And I think that what we're seeing in projects like Steve and the projects that we're doing with Da Vinci around value-based care is we're acknowledging that your insurance benefits are intrinsically tied to your care and that we can make better care decisions if we bring those two worlds back together.
Yeah, the other piece in there that you sort of touched on is that the timing loop around oncology, right, is way different. If I have to have a knee replacement done, honestly, in the most part, if I get it done tomorrow or I get it next week or I get it done 3 weeks from now, in the scheme of things, it probably doesn't matter a heck of a lot.
Yep.
Oncology, it matters, right? If I have to wait, I had a friend of ours that was diagnosed in February, about 3 weeks before COVID hit, diagnosed with something. He couldn't even get into an oncologist until May, and now he's stage 4. And maybe he was stage 4 in February when they first identified it. Who will know in retrospect? But that 2 months or 2.5 or 3 months almost it was, I guess, in between certainly didn't help the case any, right? And things like that. Let me ask one other question, sort of around this. Are you, Steve? What sort of engagement are you seeing from the vendors? You mentioned Epic doing some stuff around this. Yeah. That's great, good for them, and they obviously have a lot of the big hospital systems, and I would imagine a Cerner probably too, because they have a lot of the academic medical centers. But, are you seeing this in the ambulatory side or on the cancer EHR side? Are those folks engaged? Are those vendors engaged?
Yeah, absolutely. Epic was one of the first to commit. Each of the use cases has a different set of vendors. So around we have a radiation oncology use case. This is focusing on getting data from radiation oncology systems into EHRs. So there's vendors like Varian and Electa who are looking at using mCODE as a way to a standard language for communication there. Around the clinical pathways I mentioned before, there's companies like Flatiron, Clinical Path, McKesson, Philips, who we're talking to, and they're considering joining into the effort as well. So each of these use cases, and in the matchings, we're working with 4 different matching services now, who are essentially vendors, providing services to patients and providers. So every one of them getting the health systems and then the vendors who are usually providing services to health systems or to patients in some cases, getting them involved is critical. And so we've done pretty well. We have a lot of good software engineers on our side too who enjoy working, helping communities. So all vendors are welcome.
Got it.
I would say, as one accelerator to Steve, this is where you do your plug for your call to action, but I think that these projects are at their core human-powered efforts, right? It is the volunteers that get the work done. And I think that to Steve's point, they've had really great interest, but in order to make the accelerators really fully function, it's really about organizations coming and participating, and making themselves part of the actual project, I think is incredibly important. We've seen that, time and time again with Da Vinci, the amount of progress we've been able to make and the speed at which we've been able to progress this work really is based on the, partly in the funding, but mostly in the subject matter experts that make themselves available. Sorry.
Yeah, that was good. Very good. Wicked good conversation, guys. I would expect nothing to less.
He's making fun of us, Jocelyn.
I think he's mocking us. He's a New Yorker. That explains everything.
Yeah, I'm a partial Bostonian. So let's close out this episode. We're going to run short on time here, but Steve, here's sort of a direct line to decision makers out there, and we're happy to take and send this podcast all over the country, and I'm sure you can too, okay? And we get a lot of interesting folks that sort of read this. What do you say to decision makers at, academic medical centers, at cancer specialty clinics, at the cancer or cancer supportive VHR vendors or supporting systems out there? What do you say to them to say, guys, you got to get on board this train, and sooner beats later?
Well, everyone we've talked to gets it. That's one thing. It's really rare, whether it's a doctor or a nurse or a patient or a vendor. So that's the good news. But we really need to come, not just say it's great, let us know when it's delivered. We need people who are willing to put in the effort. And who see I think it's not a matter of, it's not altruism, though with cancer you might think that's not enough. They need to see the value proposition. They see that, okay, if I can join in Codex now, I can actually impact the direction it goes. I can actually get early insights into what's eventually coming at me from products around the world. I'll understand that. I'll be able to work directly with vendors and let them know what our needs are as a customer. Or with vendors being able to work with potential customers. The value proposition is there. And so it's just getting the word out about the different use cases, making them see that each of these use cases is focused on better care, better research, lower costs, lower burden. Those are all good things. No one can argue with that, but we need the people to come to the table. And by the way, I think once coming to the table, and this is true in any of the accelerators, FHIR is the future. There's government regulations requiring that now. And so being able to work in a FHIR accelerator has an added benefit, and I would say it's the secondary one, but it's important, of becoming part of that FHIR community, being able to advise your organization on what to do for other fields beyond oncology or prior authorization. So there's a lot of benefits to being part of these accelerators, and I really would encourage anyone who's interested to contact us, let us know.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you so very much for your time, and Jocelyn, as always, for yours also. I know you guys are both extremely busy and doing good things for humanity here, so good on you. We'll be back in a bit with the next edition. Please subscribe to us at whatever podcast carrier you use, Apple or Google. If you have any speaker thoughts, or if you have comments or suggestions on this podcast, please email us at podcast@pocp.com. Bye for now, and remember, health IT is a dish best served hot. Good day, everyone.
Thank you for listening. If your organization needs help understanding the FHIR landscape and developing or updating your interoperability roadmap to reflect requirements of the recent CMS and ONC rules, reach out to us at info@pocp.com.